Kang Sira is a Korean billionaire. Cold, controlled, untouchable. She has never, not once in her entire life, looked at a woman the way she looked at Lee Carter. But that Tuesday afternoon, in a quiet living room in Seoul, a girl walked in with a glass of water, looked up, and locked eyes with her for 5 seconds. 5 seconds. Something inside Kang Sira cracked. Something buried deep, locked under years of control, shifted without permission. She had come to collect a debt. James Carter owed her money. That was all it was supposed to be. Business, nothing personal. Until she saw his daughter. And for a moment, everything went still. She didn't show it. She never did. But inside, something unfamiliar stirred. When the negotiation ended, she gave her terms. Either she takes his business, or his daughter comes to work for her as a personal assistant for 1 year. Not a servant, a position, a deal. Then she left, got into her car, closed the door. Silence. And for the first time in years, Kang Sira thought about someone she had known for 5 seconds. Meanwhile, back inside that house, Lee Carter stood in the kitchen, heart beating slightly faster than normal, trying to understand why a stranger's eyes felt that familiar. The next morning, she called her father. Tell her I'll take the job. She told herself it was for the money. She told herself it was to help her family. But even she didn't fully believe that. This is the story of 2 women who were never supposed to fall in love, and fell anyway. Hard, quietly, completely. To understand how this story begins, you have to first understand who Kang Sira is. She was not born into wealth, not even close. Kang Sira grew up in a small apartment in a part of Seoul that nobody writes stories about. Her father worked double shifts at a factory. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night. They were not poor enough to be desperate, but they were not comfortable enough to ever exhale. She watched her parents spend their entire lives working for people who never learned their names. She made a decision at 15 years old that she would never be invisible again. By the time she was 22, she had founded her first company, a logistics consulting firm that operated on almost zero capital and pure strategy. By 27, she had acquired 2 smaller firms and rebranded them under her growing corporate umbrella. By 31, she was being featured in financial magazines. By 35, she was the kind of person other powerful people called before making decisions. Kang Sira was not a mafia boss in the cinematic sense. She was not violent. She did not deal in weapons or shadows. But she dealt in power, the kind of power that comes from holding financial leverage over people who need you more than you need them. She was a private lender, a silent investor, a woman who moved money through boardrooms and back channels with the same precision a surgeon moves a scalpel. People did not fear her because she was cruel. They feared her because she was never wrong. She calculated everything. She anticipated everything. She controlled everything, including herself. Especially herself. She had never been in a serious relationship, not because she was cold, but because she had never found anyone interesting enough to stay still for. Men pursued her. She was beautiful in the way that controlled, intelligent people often are: striking, composed, magnetic without trying. But she always moved on before anything real could form. She had never once considered the possibility of falling for a woman. Not once. Until the day she walked into James Carter's house to collect a debt. James Carter owed Kang Sira's firm $400,000. It had been 18 months since the original agreement. In that time, he had made 2 partial payments and then silence. Her financial team had sent 3 formal notices. He had responded to none of them, so Sira decided to handle this personally. She didn't do this often. She had people for this. But something about this particular case, the complete silence, the way he'd gone dark, made her want to look the man in the eyes herself. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The house was in a quiet residential neighborhood outside Seoul, not wealthy, not destitute. The kind of neighborhood where people were clearly trying. A modest house with a well-kept garden, evidence of pride, even in struggle. She knocked once. James Carter opened the door. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered but clearly tired, the kind of tired that lives in the eyes and doesn't leave. When he saw her face, something in his expression crumpled. He knew exactly why she was there. She stepped inside. The living room was clean, sparse furniture, a television that was too old, a bookshelf with too many books for the size of the room, which was the first thing that softened her, slightly, though she would not have admitted it. "Mr. Carter," she said, sitting down across from him. Her voice was even, not unkind but absolute. "You know why I'm here." He folded his hands. He explained. His business had collapsed after a supply chain disruption. He had been trying to rebuild but had been unable to recover in time. He was not running. He was not hiding. He simply had nothing to give her yet. She listened. She was very good at listening. It was the thing people underestimated about her. They expected her to interrupt, to threaten, to perform power. She never did. She simply listened and then spoke one sentence at a time until the other person had nowhere left to go. She was in the middle of forming her response when the door behind James opened, and Lee Carter walked in. She was carrying 2 mugs of tea. She had not been expecting a guest. That much was obvious from the way she stopped short when she saw Sira sitting there. She was tall, Nigerian-Korean mixed heritage, her father Nigerian-British, her mother Korean, which gave her a presence that was immediately striking. Dark skin, sharp eyes, natural hair pulled back loosely. She was wearing a plain sweater and work trousers, clearly having just come home. She looked like a person who had been having an ordinary day until this moment. She looked at Sira. Sira looked at her. 5 seconds passed. This is the part of the story that's impossible to fully explain in words because it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music swelling, no dramatic gasp. It was simply 5 seconds of eye contact between 2 strangers in which something shifted. Something quiet and enormous, like tectonic plates moving somewhere far below the surface where no one could see it yet. Lee Carter set 1 mug down in front of her father. She placed the second on the table carefully, as though she was suddenly very aware of her own hands. She looked away first. Sira felt confused. That was the only word for it. Confusion. Like her internal compass had briefly spun without reason and then snapped back, but not all the way. Not quite back to where it had been. "Why are you looking at her like that?" a voice inside her asked. She had no answer, so she returned her attention to James Carter and continued the conversation. Professionally, precisely. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, Kang Sira was not fully present in a room she was supposed to be controlling. James Carter had no money. That was the simple truth. He could offer apologies, timelines, restructured plans, but not the actual sum. Sira sat with that reality for a moment. In another context, she would have moved immediately to formal legal recovery. She had done it before without hesitation.
I know this is difficult.
But something
It's
made
just
her
so
pause.
overwhelming.
We'll get
She
through
looked
it.
at Lee
Here,
Carter,
have some tea.
who had quietly taken
Thank
a
you.
seat in the corner.
Of course.
Trying to be invisible.
We'll face this together.
Clearly listening, clearly worried. Sira made a decision. Not impulsively, she never made impulsive decisions, but quickly. The way she sometimes made decisions in boardrooms when all the information was present and the answer was obvious even if it wasn't simple. She turned back to James. "I'm not here to destroy you," she said. "That serves neither of us." She extended the repayment timeline by 12 months. She eliminated the penalty fees that had accumulated, and then she stated her condition. Lee Carter would come to work for her as a personal assistant. Not a maid, not domestic staff. A professional role managing Sira's schedule, coordinating her personal affairs, serving as a point of contact between her corporate and private life. It was a real job, a well-paying one. The room went very still. James Carter looked at his daughter. Lee Carter looked at Sira. The expression on her face was unreadable, somewhere between dignity and calculation. She was clearly an intelligent woman. She was weighing everything in that look: the power imbalance, the stakes, her family's need, her own autonomy. "Why me?" Lee asked directly. Sira appreciated the directness. Because you walked in here and immediately assessed a tense situation without showing fear or panic. That's a skill I need in my immediate environment. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Lee looked at her father once more, then back at Sierra. When do I start? The mansion was in the hills above the city. Minimalist architecture, expansive glass, gardens maintained by a staff Lee rarely saw. Everything designed to communicate one thing: this is what total control looks like. Lee Carter moved in on a Monday. She was given a private suite in the East Wing, comfortable, beautiful, nothing like anything she had lived in before. She told herself she would not be impressed. She was impressed, but she kept that to herself because the first thing she had understood about Kang Sira was this: showing vulnerability in her presence cost you something. Their routine developed quickly. Mornings began at 6 a.m. Sira was always awake before Lee, always already dressed, already reading, already 3 steps ahead of the day. Lee would bring the morning briefing documents and 2 cups of coffee, Sira's black, hers with a small amount of sugar that Sira noticed on day 3 and never commented on but always remembered. Breakfast was brief and professional. Then came the day, calls to coordinate, meetings to schedule, correspondence to manage. Sira's world operated at a speed that Lee had to sprint to match at first, but she matched it. Within 2 weeks, she had anticipated 3 scheduling conflicts. Sira hadn't flagged herself, restructured Sira's communication system to reduce daily response time by 40 minutes, and organized a filing system for her private correspondence that Sira had let accumulate for 6 months. Sira noticed all of it. She didn't say much, but she noticed. The evenings were when the texture of their dynamic began to shift. Late nights in Sira's private office, Lee at the smaller desk beside her, documents between them, the city glittering through the glass below. These were the hours when the professional structure softened slightly. Not much, but enough. Sira would sometimes make observations about the work that weren't strictly necessary, little insights, small commentaries on a client or a deal. Things she was clearly thinking out loud rather than dictating. Lee began responding, thoughtfully, honestly, not just agreeing, actually engaging. And Kang Sira, who had spent years surrounded by people who agreed with everything she said, found herself sitting up straighter in those moments, listening more carefully, recalibrating. She told herself it was because Lee was a valuable professional asset. She told herself that for almost 3 weeks. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. It happened on a Thursday night. Sira had received news that afternoon that a deal she had been building for 2 years, a strategic acquisition she had structured meticulously, had fallen through. The other party had pulled out at the final hour due to pressure from a competitor. It was a significant loss, not a fatal one, but a real one. She didn't show it. She never showed things. But Lee was observant in a way that Sira had underestimated. By 10 p.m., when the last call was done and the office was quiet, Lee didn't leave the room the way she normally would. Instead, she said, simply and quietly, "I'm sorry about the deal." Sira looked up from her desk. "It wasn't your concern," Sira said. "I know," Lee replied. "I'm still sorry." Something in that, the uncalculated simplicity of it, the fact that it was care offered without strategy, without agenda, cracked something open in Sira. Just slightly, just enough. She stood, she walked toward the window. Lee was near the bookshelf, close, but not close enough to be in her space. They stood in the same silence they had shared many times. But this silence was different. Sira turned. Lee was already looking at her. And for a moment that had no business logic, no rational framework, Sira closed the distance. The kiss was brief, soft, completely unexpected to both of them. They pulled back almost simultaneously. Sira stepped away first. The expression on her face was something Lee had never seen before, not cold, not composed, but exposed. Like someone who had been caught by their own reflection doing something they didn't recognize. "I apologize," Sira said. Her voice was quiet, controlled but barely. I shouldn't have, I didn't stop you," Lee said. "We'll forget this happened," Sierra said. Yes, Lee agreed. They said goodnight. They went to their separate rooms. Neither of them slept. The next morning, Lee arrived at 6 a.m. as always. Sierra was already at her desk. Coffee was already made, both cups, Lee's with the small amount of sugar. She did not acknowledge what had happened. Not by look, not by tone, not by a single deviation from their established routine. Lee matched her energy precisely. They were both very, very good at pretending. But pretending is exhausting when the other person is always in the room. The silence between them, once comfortable, professional, structured, became charged. Every time their hands came close over a document, there was an awareness that hadn't been there before. Every time their eyes met across the room, they each looked away a fraction of a second faster than they needed to. Every perfectly professional exchange carried a subtext that neither of them was willing to name. By day 3, Lee noticed that Sierra had started positioning herself slightly differently in rooms, slightly more aware of distance, as though recalibrating the space between them required conscious effort now. By day 5, Sierra noticed that Lee had started being slightly more formal, using full sentences where she would once have used shorthand, maintaining a posture that was professional in the way people are professional when they are guarding something. The kiss had not ruined anything. It had, somehow, made everything more real. And that was worse. Sierra had been invited to a high society gala, the kind of event she attended perhaps 4 times a year. Industry, elite, diplomatic circles, old money and new power in the same room trying to pretend they liked each other. She told Lee she would need her there. As your assistant, Lee asked. A pause. Yes, Sierra said. The dress Lee wore was provided, a deep emerald silk gown that fell to the floor. Sierra wore white, which on her was severe and luminous at once. They arrived together in a black car and walked into a room full of some of the most influential people in Korea, and Lee Carter did not flinch once. That was the thing Sierra kept coming back to, privately, throughout the evening. Lee moved through that room, this room full of people who held power the way others hold weapons, and she was not intimidated. She was curious. She observed. She engaged when engaged. She was graceful in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or breeding and everything to do with character. People noticed her. Sierra noticed people noticing her, and felt something she had not anticipated, the very first tremor of possessiveness. Later in the evening, with champagne in hand and the formalities behind them, they found a quieter corner of the terrace. The city was below them. The night air was cool and soft. Do you enjoy these events? Lee asked. No, Sierra said immediately, then catching herself. They're necessary. Lee laughed softly. It was the most unguarded sound Sierra had ever heard from her. What was it like? Lee asked. Building something from nothing. Did you ever doubt yourself? The question was so direct, so genuinely curious, not flattering, not performative. Sierra looked at her. Every day for the first 4 years, she said. And then I stopped, not because the doubt disappeared, because I decided it wasn't useful. That's the loneliest kind of strength, Lee said quietly. Sierra was silent for a long moment. Yes, she finally said, it is. They stood together looking at the city below, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither of them moved away. And that was the moment. Not the kiss, not the arrangement, not the 5 seconds in James Carter's living room, but this moment on a terrace above the city, champagne in hand, the night surrounding them like a held breath, that something between them became impossible to deny. They didn't speak in the car back. But the silence was different now. It wasn't avoidance. It wasn't the careful distance of 2 people managing a situation. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of reasons to pretend. They reached the mansion. They walked inside. In the corridor between their wings, they stopped. Sierra looked at Lee. Lee did not look away. I need to tell you something, Sierra said. Her voice was steady but stripped of its usual armor. I don't know what this is. I've never, she stopped. I need you to understand that I'm not someone who acts without thinking. Everything I've ever done has been considered, calculated, but the way I feel in your presence. You don't have to explain it, Lee said softly. I want to, Sierra said. I want you to know that this isn't careless. What I feel isn't careless. Lee took a small step forward. I know, she said. I've known for a while. What happened next was not rushed. It was not dramatic. It was the quietest possible version of two people finally allowing themselves to arrive somewhere they had been moving toward since the very beginning. That night, the mansion, which had always felt like a monument to control, felt like something warmer. Like a home. Sunrise came through the eastern windows the way it always did. Slow, silver, indifferent to human drama. Sierra was awake before it. She lay still for a long time, looking at the ceiling, allowing herself the unusual experience of not moving toward the next task. Just being still, being present in a moment that was completely unlike any other she had lived in. Lee woke quietly, and for a few seconds before either of them spoke, they simply looked at each other in the early morning light, with none of the armor that usually surrounded them and all of the reality of what they were. I need to say something, Sierra said. All right. I've never experienced this before, she said it plainly. No drama, just the quiet, certain weight of truth. Not with anyone, not like this, and I don't fully know what that means, but I know that what I feel is real. I'm not confused about the feeling. I'm only confused about, she paused, about why I was so certain I didn't need it. Lee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have felt this before, not with you specifically, but with women before. I never had the courage to follow it. I think I was waiting for something that felt safe enough to be honest. She looked at Sierra. You were not what I expected safe to look like. Sierra smiled, slowly, genuinely. It was the kind of smile that people who are very controlled only allow themselves when no one important is watching, except Lee was watching. And that was enough. They spent the morning talking in a way they had never allowed themselves to before. Not about work, not about schedules or clients or the logistics of their strange arrangement. They talked about themselves, about who they were before this house, before this story, before each other. Lee talked about growing up between cultures, her father's Nigerian-British family in London, her mother's Korean relatives in Seoul, never quite fully belonging to either world. You spend so much time being translated, she said. Everyone is always asking you to explain yourself. Sierra, who had spent her entire adult life being explained by other people, in articles, in boardrooms, in whispered conversations at events like last night's, understood that in a way she hadn't expected. I've spent my whole life making sure no one could define me before I defined myself, Sierra said. I think somewhere along the way I stopped letting anyone in at all. It felt safer. Safe, Lee repeated softly. That's an interesting word. You've never seemed like someone who prioritized safety. Professional safety and emotional safety are completely different things, Sierra said. One I've mastered, the other, she looked at Lee, I may have avoided. The conversation didn't resolve anything neat or immediate. Real feelings rarely do, but it created something more valuable than resolution. It created understanding. The foundation on which something real could actually stand. 2 weeks later, Sierra called James Carter directly. She had her lawyer prepare the documents. Debt, fully discharged, no remaining obligation, no conditions. James Carter was silent on the line for a very long time. Why? He asked finally. Because the arrangement served its purpose, Sierra said. And because the terms of what your daughter agreed to were based on a financial pressure that should no longer exist. There was another long silence. You're a different kind of person than I thought you were, he said quietly. Most people are, she replied. She told Lee that evening. Lee sat with the information for a moment. Then she said, So I'm no longer required to be here. No, Sierra said carefully. You're not. A pause stretched between them. The kind of pause that contains an enormous amount of unspoken consequence. Good, Lee said finally. I'd rather choose to be here than be here because I have to be. She did not move toward the door. What they built over the following weeks was not a performance. It was quiet. It was careful. It was two women who had both spent years building walls, discovering, slowly, that some walls are not protection, they are prisons. Sira changed in ways that surprised her own staff before they surprised herself. She began leaving the office before midnight. She began laughing in the mornings, a sound so unfamiliar that her housekeeper privately wondered if something was wrong. She began asking questions about other people that were not strategic, questions asked simply because she was curious. Because someone had reminded her that curiosity about people you care for is not a vulnerability. It is the whole point. Lee changed too. She stopped holding herself at a slight angle, that habitual half-step back that she had maintained since arriving, as though always ready to retreat. She stopped monitoring herself so carefully in Sira's presence. She began to take up space, not aggressively, but naturally. The way people do when they are finally in a room where they are genuinely wanted. They took walks together in the evenings. They cooked on Sunday mornings badly, in Sira's case, and with surprising skill in Lee's. They disagreed regularly about small things and large things, and neither of them backed down simply to preserve peace. That, more than anything, was the truest sign of what they had. Not the softness, but the courage to be honest within it. The conversation with James Carter was not planned. He came to the mansion one Sunday, the first time he had visited since Lee had moved in. He was there to see his daughter, to have lunch, to check on a situation that he had privately worried about since the beginning. He had told himself his concern was protective. He had tried not to examine it too closely. But fathers notice things. He had noticed, in phone calls over the preceding months, that his daughter's voice had changed. That there was a warmth in it he hadn't heard in years. That she had stopped speaking about her situation here with the careful language of someone enduring something, and had started speaking about it with the unguarded language of someone living something. He knew before they told him. When they sat down together after lunch, all three of them at the long table in the garden, and Lee said quietly, "Dad, there's something we need to tell you." James Carter set down his tea and folded his hands and waited. It was Sira who spoke first, directly, not apologetically, but respectfully. "I love your daughter," she said. "I want you to understand that this is not a situation of imbalance or obligation. Your debt is cleared. Lee is not here because she has to be. She is here because she chooses to be, and I intend to honor that choice." James Carter was quiet for a long time. He was a man of his generation, a man of faith and tradition. A man who had never imagined this particular conversation sitting across a Korean billionaire's garden table in the hills above Seoul. He had a lot of thoughts, and they did not all point the same direction, and he knew that about himself. He looked at Lee. Lee met his eyes without flinching, and what he saw there, it was not defiance. It was not a challenge. It was the face of his daughter at peace with herself in a way she had never quite managed before. Settled. Whole. "Are you happy?" he asked, just that, just those three words. "Yes, Dad, I am," she said softly. He exhaled, long and slow. He picked up his tea. He was quiet for another moment. And then James Carter said, "She forgave a debt she didn't have to forgive. She is honest about what she wants. And my daughter is sitting here like herself, fully, which is the only thing I ever wanted." He looked at Sira. "You are not what I expected." "I know," Sira said. "That seems to be a pattern," he said dryly. And then, unexpectedly, he smiled. There is a version of this story that people expect. The billionaire who cannot love. The woman from the outside world who humanizes her. The predictable arc of power dissolving into vulnerability. Vulnerability dissolving into love. Love resolving into a clean and simple ending. But this story never followed expectations. Kang Sira did not become a softer person. She remained precise. Driven, formidable. But she became a person who could be softened by someone. One person. The right person. And she stopped believing that was weakness. She stopped believing it the first morning she woke up to the sound of Lee laughing at something in the kitchen below, the most ordinary sound imaginable, and felt it like a frequency in her chest that her entire life had been too loud and too controlled to hear before. Lee Carter did not become who she was because of Sira. She had always been who she was: intelligent, strong, perceptive, full of a quiet grace that the world had been too busy trying to categorize to fully see. What changed was not who she was. What changed was that she finally stopped apologizing for it. The debt was cleared. The arrangement was over. But the two women chose, freely, deliberately, with full understanding of everything they were and everything they came from, to stay. Not because of obligation, not because of proximity, not because of the strange gravity of a 5-second moment in a modest living room on a Tuesday afternoon, but because they had looked at each other, across cultures, across classes, across every wall they had each spent years building, and decided that what they saw was worth more than the safety of those walls. This is what no one tells you about the most powerful kinds of love. They don't arrive loudly. They don't announce themselves with grand gestures or perfect timing. They arrive quietly, in a room where one woman came to collect a debt and the other walked in with 2 cups of tea. They arrive in 5 seconds of silence that changes everything. And they stay, not because they have to, but because some things, once found, cannot be unfound.